Friends, lovely to have you with us. James, very good to see you.
Very good to see you too, Ian. Yeah,
And you're keeping well.
I am keeping well. Yeah,
Good.
I'm now into my dotage. I've turned 60 years old, and yeah,
Wow, fantastic. There we go.
shocker.
I
Yeah,
know.
but
Yeah. I'm sure
um,
all the viewers are saying, really, James, you don't look that old. And
of course they are. Yeah, thank you for
friends,
that's very
if you
kind of
think
you.
that, do say something in the comments. Not too sarcastic either. So.
Yeah, try to avoid the sarcasm. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. So there we go. Well, happy birthday to you for whenever it was. Um,
Thank you.
Now, James, we do like people to do four things, just a reminder, don't we?
We do. Yeah, please do like the videos. Click like.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Do subscribe to the channel.
Yeah. Subscription button down there. Yeah.
Do share on the social media.
Yeah, you do. So click on the share this and then you
Share link
thing,
and
copy it and paste it. Yeah.
and do comment on the
Yeah.
on the videos, yeah, either on YouTube or wherever they're posted on social media. Yeah, be great.
Now, what's quite interesting is that we're back in Mark's Gospel.
We're
Hooray!
finally back in March, yeah, and hopefully for
Oh,
a good chunk now of the summer. Yeah,
yeah. And that's great because we love Mark's refreshing speed,
yeah,
intensity, and the energy, don't we?
yeah, absolutely.
Directness of it. So
Yeah,
that's really
yeah,
exciting. But
yeah.
we've got something slightly odd going on with the lectionary here, haven't we?
We have because we've got a passage Mark 2:23 to 3:6 and for Trinity 1, but depending on when Easter is, we do or do not get this passage
No,
because
indeed.
Easter is later in the year.
No, no,
Then
no. This year, Easter is slightly earlier.
that's right. So if Easter is
If
later, we
Easter is
miss it.
later. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
if
do.
Easter is later, we miss it.
Yeah.
But if it's earlier, we get it. And I think we haven't actually read it for a little while.
No, we haven't.
But it's a great passage, and it's right. I mean, it's right sort of the first few chapters of Mark are particularly frantic
Yes.
and intense.
Yes.
So, and this is kind of the sort of last bit of the really frantic stuff. So, so we get lots and lots of little stories which are really profound and important.
Yep.
In quick succession.
We do.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in Mark 1 and Mark 2 that you sort of get this sort of almost a life in the day of Jesus, where it looks as though lots of things happen like one to the other. But clearly what Mark is doing is sampling and saying, look, this is the kind of ministry Jesus had in these early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a ministry which is particularly, I think, contrast in this here with increasing levels of conflict.
Yes.
Whether it's conflict with the demonic, conflict with the scribes, conflict with the Pharisees, kind of about other people. So we do get this sense of, and Mark, this is very much true of Mark, really right through in the gospel. Conflict is a major theme. Jesus stirs it up. It is not gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This is a Jesus who confronts people with all sorts of things which are wrong in their thinking and their understanding and their practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose that's it's just an encouragement. I don't know anybody who's engaged in kind of ministry or just, in terms of your own discipleship, day to day, week to week. The fact that Jesus provoked this hostility, essentially that the discipleship isn't going to be about making people happy and pleasing them all the time.
No. And it's interesting, isn't it, how often Christianity in the West seems to have adopted that as what sort of as a test, yes, as a right thing. Whereas, there's far more conflict and controversy in the Gospels than there is in many people's pastoral ministerial practice. Interesting.
Yeah, it does. Now, the passage, as you said, the passage is Mark 2, beginning of verse 23, and it goes through over to chapter 3. Again, possibly an example of where the chapter division. Thank you very much, Stephen Langton, in the 13th century. Isn't probably quite in the right place in the sense that these episodes do belong together, don't they? We've got the conflict around them.
Yeah, they clearly do, don't they? Because they're both about Sabbath.
Sabbath observance and what is lawful. Yeah. So,
and that's understandable in the sense that the two great markers of Judaism were circumcision and Sabbath. Those are things which set them apart from the way people around them. So it's not at all surprising that, in the sense that this is something which is addressed here. Yeah.
Now, one thing that I think is really interesting, and again, we keep saying this, that the lectionary chunks up the passages, and we actually do need to look carefully at the context, because looking at this passage, one of the things I was very struck by is the episode, or rather episode, Jesus' teaching that immediately precedes it.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, it's interesting for a couple of reasons, but one is that it's a very vivid image. It's one that people know, and it's given rise to an important renewal movement in the Church of England.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's the discussion about no one, Jesus says in Mark 2:21, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, i.e., no new cloth on an old garment, because if it does, then when it shrinks, it tears away. And of course, in modern fabrics, we're not familiar with that. But of course, in the old days, when you bought clothes, the first thing you did before you wore them is you washed them.
Yeah.
Because they weren't pre-shrunk.
No.
Which again just reminds me of how
Yeah.
if we're very removed from the world of the New Testament, that removal only happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Actually, we're much more, when we were kids, our parents' lives were actually significantly closer in terms of just these everyday realities.
Yeah, we have to work harder, don't we?
We do. And then he goes on, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, I think there's two things, and I've got a whole article on the wine.
Yeah.
I think there's two mistakes made in popular readings of this. One mistake is the idea that the wineskins are structures. Actually, parallels in rabbinical teaching show us that the wineskins are actually the people. It's people who hold this teaching. The new wine is a new teaching of Jesus, and he needs new people. Hence, he calls the 12, because he's renewing Israel from within. And the other thing people make the mistake is to say, oh, well, get rid of the old and the new replaces the old. So the teaching of Jesus means we don't need to pay attention to the Old Testament, when in fact, and you look at the parallel in Luke, it says that both are preserved, and he says, actually, you always prefer old wine, Jesus in the Luke parallel. So
it's interesting.
Have both. And again, Matthew has that emphasis. So I think that's such an important context. It seems to me that we can then read these things about the Sabbath observance as saying, Jesus saying, oh no, forget about Sabbath observance. We don't need Sabbath observance because I've got a new teaching coming here, which isn't the case.
He's not throwing it out. He's not throwing out Torah. He's not throwing out Sabbath and all the rest of what the Torah talks about. He's calling for a new understanding and approach to it, which is actually, as I think we'll discover, profoundly focused around himself.
Yeah.
But he's not throwing it out.
No, indeed. So should we plunge into the passage? Just some interesting things to note about Mark's language here, isn't there? So again, he starts, well, our English translation smooth this out, don't they? One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. And I was just struck by the fact that, again, in the Greek, kai agenetor auton, it's a slightly unusual construction. And I think it was Dick France, I've got his commentary here, a big NIG commentary.
Yes.
I mean, he calls this as a Semitism, but it seems to me this is in the early parts of Mark's Gospel, he is trying to make an effort of this sounding like a bit like you're reading the Old Testament still.
Yes, I think we mentioned this before, haven't we? Yeah. He does use these Semitisms, and maybe there is that self-consciousness of writing scriptural style. Yeah.
And then, sorry, you were going to say?
No, I wasn't there. It's all right. Carry on.
We're out of practice in terms of our banter here.
We are a little bit. We're a bit rusty, aren't we?
Sorry about that, folks. Now, I came across this when I was doing O-level RE many years ago, and had William Barclay, and he says, look, the disciples are going through this grain field. Again, the grammar's a little bit good. It feels a little bit stiff. In fact, the grain fields, the word for that is places that have been sown. But of course, the grain's obviously the seed has grown up. It's germinated.
It's grown up, yes, exactly.
So this must be around sort of April, May time in terms of the year, although the chronology of time of year isn't important to Mark here, because he's gathered this stuff together. And they're doing 4 things, aren't they? Which are quote unquote breaking the law as far as the Pharisees are concerned.
Yeah.
Well, do you tell us what they're doing?
Well, they're walking, they're traveling, and so some people say, is that a problem?
Yeah.
Are they actually taking more than they're allowed to through the Sabbath law? So you were allowed to essentially, I suppose, glean, really, weren't you? But you weren't allowed to sort of harvest.
No, exactly. So by plucking, it looks like they're harvesting, doesn't it?
Yeah. But that's not really what the case is. Anyway, they're doing it on the Sabbath, so that's work.
Barclay says he thinks they're doing 4 things because they are.
And what's the 4th thing?
They're plucking, and then they're rubbing.
Oh, yeah.
And then they're winnowing by blowing, and then they're eating, so they're preparing a meal.
Yeah.
I think that's trifle.
I think that's a little bit far-fetched. The text doesn't tell you they're doing that, do they?
No.
So it's something quite simple. I think basically this is the issue here is that plucking grain is considered it was considered by the Pharisees from the Mishnah to be work.
Yeah.
And actually, the big problem here in all of this is about the definition of work on the Sabbath, isn't it?
It is.
In the background here.
Now, you mentioned the Mishnah, but of course, the Mishnah as a written document is obviously a couple of centuries later.
It is, but the traditions which were written down in the Mishnah are already firmly embedded in Pharisaical teaching about this stage in the first century. So I think,
and in fact, there's a big debate about this. We know from, for instance, the Book of Jubilees, which is 2 centuries BC. That there's quite careful exploration, isn't there? Two Jubilees, Book of Jubilees, chapter 50, if you want to look at it, folks. Exploration of exactly what counts as work and what isn't work and what's allowed. So now, there's a couple of interesting dynamics, isn't there? Because on the one hand, there's a passage in Deuteronomy 23 which actually does say, if you go through your neighbor's field, you're allowed to pluck with your hand as long as you don't put your sickle in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there is actually a regulation there.
Yeah.
And I suppose the issue is in these debates, when we do have this framework of teaching from the Old Testament, is the important thing about the precision by which we observe it, or is it about what's the goal and intention of the text?
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
And Jesus's appeal is to the text. It's interesting, isn't it, that his response to the Pharisees is not, "Oh, chuck that out." It is to say, "Oh, let's go and read some other passages."
Yeah, exactly. And he immediately, he goes. I mean, perhaps this was quite unexpected. I suspect that the Pharisees were quite taken aback by where he goes to the whole question of David and the bread of the presence and about, isn't it? I mean, that would have been.
This is in the passage is 1 Samuel 21, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because you might have expected him to argue from Torah, or you might have expected him to argue from, some of their traditions, but he doesn't at all. He goes straight back to Scripture, and isn't it a fascinating passage that he chooses? And the question about why he chooses and how he uses this passage, I think, is really fascinating, isn't it?
Now, we notice in other places as well, when Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees, he actually, rather than answering the question in the terms they've expressed it, he actually, as it were, undoes the terms of the question.
He does. It's typical.
He says, "Well, you're asking the wrong question. Let's have a look at it in a different way."
Yeah.
So, in one sense, it's characteristic of him to
It is.
just on the debate about marriage. They're debating a text in Deuteronomy, and he says, "Well, let's go back and look at Genesis, for example."
He does. Yeah.
Now, why do you think he's chosen this passage about David?
Well, my suspicion is ultimately, I think, that there is a sense in which he's identified. I mean, this is actually the first time David is mentioned in Mark.
Yes.
Of course, he's mentioned again, Bartimaeus, son of David, and then later on in the Passion narrative. But this is the first time David is mentioned in Mark, and it seems to me that there's an important connection which Jesus is making between himself as the son of David and therefore as and actually a claim to divine and royal kingship. So the idea here, I think, ultimately is that if David had this authority to do this, then how much more than does Jesus, the Son of Man, the Son of God, able to be the Lord of the Sabbath? So I think there's an identification going on there, though it may take a little while for us to kind of get to that point. But that seems to me where he's ultimately headed. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that's really interesting, because that does tie in with what you hinted at earlier on, where you talk about the fact that Jesus doesn't displace Torah, doesn't displace Sabbath observance, but says you need to interpret it through him, because actually that connection with David means that Jesus is making this radical claim to authority in verse 28, where he says, as you say, you can only make sense of Sabbath through the authority of the Son of
God.
Well, Son of Man, the title of everything. I mean, I think it's probably extrapolated too much. We get into Hebrews when it talks about our Sabbath rest is in Jesus, but I mean that's a lot more theologically developed. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that he then takes center stage, and we read the Torah, we read the Old Testament through knowing who Jesus is.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a couple of interesting things about the way he cites the passage, though. I mean, the first thing he does say in verse 26, how David entered the house of God. Well, actually, he's talking quite sort of approximate and summary terms there. When you look at 1 Samuel 21, David doesn't actually do that.
No.
But of course, the other big question is, he says, the time of Abiathar the high priest. Now, this is a subject of some debate, because actually it was Ahimelech who was the high priest.
It was, yeah.
Now, do we have an example here of, according to Mark, Jesus not knowing his Old Testament? Or is this Mark just being unhistorical?
Yeah, no, I mean, I suspect there's more. I think there are more nuanced explanations than that.
Okay, we like nuance.
Yes, I mean, for viewers, I mean, Ahimelech was Abiathar's father,
right?
So there is a familial connection here, and he became high priest, but after this incident. So we need to put that into the sort of historical kind of context. And also, Abiathar was actually more associated with the reign of David than Ahimelech.
Yeah, he was.
So in a sort of, there are interesting things going on there. But what do you think, Ian? What's your sense of what the best explanation is?
Well, it's interesting because there is textual evidence that some of the first copyists realized that this didn't actually fit exactly with the text, because some of the manuscripts omit that phrase, Abiathar the high priest. I think there's a number of different ways of reading this. I mean, it is interesting that if we say this is a historical error, we are presuming that Mark and Mark's assistants, because we know people didn't do writing on their own, or Jesus himself, were ignorant of the text and made just an ignorant blunder. And I think it's interesting that idea only emerges in a context where modern readers themselves are ignorant and might not have noticed that unless some expert points out to them.
I think that's right.
So it seems to me that the idea that there's just simply an error here looks culturally extremely unlikely.
It does.
We see that the first copies say, look, that doesn't fit exactly. And I think there's a number of different dimensions. One is that we know that high priests, fathers and sons ran concurrently, number one. Number two, we also know in this sort of approximate speech, and I think it's interesting for me why the fact that Jesus is speaking quite sort of in summary, approximate terms here. And of course, the passage is very condensed anyway. The text is quite compressed. And we quite often say something like, "Oh, well, example that I think I read online where somebody says President Roosevelt during the Second World War did this." Well, during the Second World War, he wasn't president.
He wasn't. No, exactly.
So, but we're quite happy to use that language because we identify someone because through the title that they later assumed.
Exactly.
I think the other dynamic here is, of course, we've got to remember that there's no Bible and chapter and verse references here. So you have to find a way of referring to a particular section of scripture. And I know Dick France is quite skeptical about this, but it seems to me that actually the phrase in the time of the Greek phrase he uses can be understood to be in that section about. And of course, we know that Jesus in having a debate with the Sadducees, he says, what is in the section about the burning bush?
What
does Scripture say? So you have to have these approximate ways. So I think you have to be demanding at every one of those levels a kind of wooden literalism in Jesus' reference to think that this is just an example of historical error.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
So I'm not sure which of those ways of reading is the most persuasive.
No, and it's probably we probably wouldn't be able to answer that without deeper understanding of the culture, which is not actually accessible to us. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
So then we get into our second episode. And this is why these two passages seem to belong together. It seems to me, I don't know how you felt about this. It says, again, he entered the synagogue and it was a Sabbath. Now,
he's already done that once, of course, in Mark.
Well, he has.
Chapter 1.
But I wasn't sure whether to read this episode as Mark assuming it happened on the same day as the previous one, because obviously they're two Sabbaths. It seemed to me to be, when he says, again, he entered a synagogue, it seems to me he's just referring to Jesus' habitual
habit of going to the synagogue.
Going to synagogue on a Sabbath. Yeah.
And it feels quite logical that this incident happens just straight after the previous one. So they perhaps been plucking grain and they walk and they arrive at the synagogue and enter it. But it is interesting that the first incident in the synagogue in Capernaum was in chapter 1. Jesus heals the demoniac. And that's not controversial at that stage. It's not, there's no sort of aggro about that. And actually, of course, he does it in response to the demon proclaiming who he is. Whereas, and here, it is another controversial. There's another act of power by Jesus, which I think is the thing that links them. So it's interesting. All the time Mark tells these stories, he's always revealing something more of the person of Jesus Christ to us. Every single incident in these early days tells us a bit more about Jesus. It's fascinating. If you start adding up, what have I learned?
Yeah, it's building a cumulative picture.
Cumulative picture, yeah. And it accumulates very rapidly.
It does. Yeah. The other thing that's fascinating is that, again, in these very compressed stories, Mark manages to sort of give us a sense of what's going on. So, you know, the fact that, and they watch Jesus as he comes in, you can almost feel the atmosphere crackling, can't you, with the tension?
Yes.
Okay, he did something controversial before. Now they can see there's a man here who's got I don't suppose we know what the exact condition is, but he's got a withered arm of some sort.
Yes.
And is atrophied. And they're it's interesting, isn't it, that the Pharisees, they see Jesus, who they know can heal, someone they know needs healing, and they're just waiting to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's like so entertain us with something by doing something that we don't like, Jesus, and then we'll tell you off about it.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary. And what the other interesting thing about the way Mark tells the story is his emphasis on emotion and feeling from Jesus. I mean, he has anger and grief and everything, and that's really interesting in a compressed account.
Yeah.
You get profound insights. He has got an extraordinary economy of language.
Yeah. There's some interesting dynamics here about the person being healed, because a little while ago I wrote an article about, is God disabled, and about the whole issue about disability. And one commentator, who I won't name because I think it's too embarrassingly bad, says in the healing accounts in the Gospels, the person being healed is a mere sort of toy that Jesus uses to demonstrate his power. And I think that's not the case at all, actually. You know, and these people are portrayed sympathetically, and they're often very rounded characters in the narrative as well. Now, it's interesting here that Jesus says to the man, "Come here." So he does actually put him on display, which in that context makes me feel, well, that feels a little bit awkward, because, you know, Jesus is getting people to look at, well, they're already looking at them both. But what I found really striking is the fact that there's no magical performance here. He simply says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And as the man stretches it out, it's healed. There's no kind of abracadabra. There's no special formulas. Jesus doesn't even
lay hands on him.
He does later, like lay hands on him or make spittle and rub it on his eyes or anything. There's none of that at all. It's incredibly undramatic.
It is very low key. Much more emphasis, I think, in Jesus' question to the Pharisees, which is fantastically put, isn't it? Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? Now, if you think about that, they don't answer that, of course, because they're silent. Because if they answer one way or the other, they're kind of
hoisted by their own petard.
They're hoisted on their own petard, exactly. You know, so Jesus has and what he's done is I think he's really replaced this idea of whether you can do work on the Sabbath is whether you can do good on the Sabbath. You know, and that's become the measure of Sabbath keeping, if you like.
And of course, again, in doing that, he isn't displacing Sabbath. He's appealing, or he isn't displacing Torah, rather. He's actually appealing within what the Torah itself says.
Yes, exactly. Which
if you have a donkey that falls into a pit, are you not allowed to pull it out? Of course you are, because the law says you are. Because the whole purpose of Sabbath is for it to be a blessing and to be a place of and refreshing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, this phrase, hardness of heart, as well. He's grieved at their hardness of heart. I think that's really fascinating, actually, because he's obviously, in earlier situations, he's moved with pity. In Mark 1 and 41. Here he's moved in respect of the people who are against him, and that causes him grief. Now that's a really interesting. I mean, there's anger, yes, but there's also grief. You know, which I think is a fascinating insight into the character of Jesus.
And in fact, the word that Mark uses here suggests it's often used in the context of grieving with others. It's a sharing in this. So. Which is again quite an unusual word, but there's a sense of anger at the injustice here, of the fact that, you know, they created an obstacle for this person to experience their healing.
Yes, and of course the heart is the seat of, you know, we tend to think of hearts about love and the rest of it, but of course in Hebrew thought, it's the seat of discernment, spiritual discernment, wisdom, understanding, and their hardness of heart is essentially about their refusal to see who he is. They don't discern who he is. So and that's the problem, and that's always the problem in the Gospels, when people don't see who Jesus is.
I also love, going back to this, the dynamic with the man. I love the fact that although the man is kind of on show, which feels awkward, what I find really interesting is that Jesus gives him agency. So he participates. He's not a sort of passive victim. Jesus says to him, "You need to do something here, and as you do this, you'll see the healing." And I think the other thing I found, I know it's only a little word here, but I was very struck by it. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored.
Yes.
In other words, it wasn't just as though there's an illness here which has been healed or a bad thing that's been resolved. It's actually gone back to what God always intended it to be in his good creation. And there's that phrase, I've forgotten, is it Hans Kung, that the kingdom of God is creation healed?
Yes.
And so always Jesus is seeking to restore and to set right and take back to what God's original intention was. I mean, it's only a little word, but it's a little sort of hint there as to what Jesus' kingdom ministry is all about.
Yes, we call that realized eschatology, wouldn't we, or something? Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah,
in a little way, in a minor sort of simple way.
Yeah, but it's not just about the future. It's actually about
no, it's not. No, not at all.
This is
about right here in the present.
Yeah.
And then,
go on.
Then we get back chapter verse 6, don't we? Which is which is this extraordinary connection between the Pharisees and the Herodians. I mean, it's a little bit like, I suppose it's a bit like saying somebody shows up in modern day America and manages to unite the Republicans and the Democrats in opposition to something. I mean,
indeed. Now, tell us a bit more why that is. So the Pharisees were most.
Of course, the Pharisees were. Yeah, I mean, the Pharisees believed that the kingdom would be restored to Israel through righteous observance of the law.
Yeah.
The Herodians are those within the Jewish community who are supporters of Herod Antipas and actually essentially collaborators with the occupying Roman forces. So these are two groups that essentially have a completely different philosophy about the real politic of Palestine in that time, which of course is not just about politics; it's about religion. It's everything. It's not a single entity like or not. They're not separate entities like we would think of them: religion, politics, whatever. So that's really quite a surprising partnership, and Jesus must have really annoyed them to cause this. Yeah,
and it's a little window as well into locating this whole story in the context of the Judaisms of the first century.
Indeed.
And the inter-Nicene, the intertribal conflict between the different groups.
Yeah.
So we have the Pharisees, we also have the Sadducees, we also have the those zealots who want to, and of course
saints.
And the group in the desert as well. So it is a complex thing. What, just to finish on the passage, the thing I was really struck by is the strength of the language here again. I mean, we talked about all the emotions there are in this, but they don't just they plot together. The other gospels say they plot together against him, but here they plot how to destroy him. I mean, it's really final language, isn't it? This is
and quite early on in the sort of narrative, really. Yeah. He's a huge political problem for them. Right from the word go. Yeah.
Now, we've worked through the passage. Just sort of final reflection, really, in terms of like preaching and teaching on this. I've been very struck by your emphasis in saying, well, you can see how the emotions are working and how the different people react to them. But the central focus of this for Mark, in terms of the narrative, is who Jesus is and what we find revealed about him through these interactions and these conflicts.
Yeah. And I do think that's something that's worth emphasizing in preaching, because it can be, especially when you're dealing with individual stories, you can get a bit too sort of bound up in sort of the details of thinking about what this, what does this mean for today? And that's important. It's important, but the big picture, it must never be lost sight of, because I think Mark's whole purpose in telling a particular story at a particular time in a particular place in the narrative is to reveal Jesus, just to build up that picture, that overall picture. And we need to receive the truth about Jesus, and that's what Mark's scheme is all about, really, I think.
And through these episodes, we find that Jesus is the one who gives us the real interpretation of Torah. Jesus is the one who mediates to us the true blessings of Sabbath keeping. Jesus is the one who is greater than David. We're getting a glimpse of that. Jesus is the one who brings healing and who brings restoration that God always intends for us to have.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much. Friends, thank you for joining us, and don't forget to do those 4 things. If you click the like and you share and subscribe, and if there's anything here we've talked about which has struck you, then do make a comment. And if you want to challenge us, that's fine. Or if you want to share other insights, we'd love to see those. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. James, see you next time.
Indeed.